The Cost of Survival by Callum Davis. Acolyte Dupenza placed a hand inside his dust-encrusted robes and squeezed the form of the ancient tome cocooned in the inside pocket. Still there, he thought. Though they had not left the chapel in some hours, he found himself checking if the rag was still with him over and over. "You check because you care, because you have faith," he said to himself. He knew it was his duty to keep the volume safe, and a part of him knew he felt safer for carrying it. The life, works, and purges of St. Cuthbert the Inexorable it was. "Emperor, if you grant me but a tenth of the saint's resolve, endurance and hatred for his enemies, I swear I shall dedicate entire systems to your devotion one day," Dupenza prayed. He pulled his arm outside his robes and rested it upon his navel with the other, readjusting himself on the stone floor in a futile attempt to find a comfortable position. Even this slight gesture caused a puff of the dust that coated his garments to leap into the air, lit by the faint moonlight and the flash of distant explosions. Some were the burning reds, oranges, and yellows of Imperial shells. Others were of a malignant, electrified green. He was absolutely caked in the dust. His companions were no different. They had barely escaped the collapse of the great colonnade of St. Lythopolos, the builder, with their lives. The other acolytes sat on the floor in the center of the chapel with him. Sister Lincenser clutched a gilded box containing a fingerbone of St. Lustia, the martyr hospitaller. She rocked back and forth, whispering a liturgy. Brother Arpo sat in silence, reading from Studies on Vinification and the Sweet Uses of its Produce in Honouring He Most High, by St. Brutger Laelus. Arpo had always been a diligent student, but he reads to calm himself, to distract himself from our predicament, thought Dupenza. There were others there, each entrusted with other priceless treasures to protect. And what a predicament it was. Dupenza and his fellow acolytes were trapped in this lonely chapel, so obscure he did not know its name. Its frescoes, depicting angelic figures walking through verdant fields and forests, were heavily faded and pockmarked. There were plinths for 8 statues, though only 2 stood. Others had collapsed under their own weight, or missing entirely, probably moved elsewhere to decorate grander places of worship. The pews, shaped in a quarter circle so all could face the center of the chapel, were chipped and half-rotten. All were now pressed up against the chapel's 4 doors, or lined along the wall. Troops of the 211th Argolishian Creedsmen stood atop them, peering out of the chapel's windows for signs of the enemy. They were visibly frightened. Those not on sentry duty behaved similarly to Dupenza's fellow acolytes. They prayed or read. Some slept. Their uniforms, once a vivid red, were blackened by burn marks and dulled by thick layers of dust and ash. Such brave soldiers of the Emperor, Dupenza thought. The Creedsmen had stood toe-to-toe with the xenos of metal and lightning that attacked, and they had survived. Were it not for them, Dupenza and his colleagues would long be dead. The Creedsmen rescued them. Faith Lieutenant Arya had led them to take shelter in this chapel. For that, Dupenza could not be more grateful, but he was not thankful for their position. "I'm hungry," said Arpo. "As are we all," said Dupenza. None of them had eaten since before they had escaped with the Creedsmen. Dupenza saw Arpo's eyes wander over a pair of corpses set against the wall. Both had been lain gently, still wearing their packs, their arms folded across their chests in the sign of the Aquila. "They might still have some of their rations," whispered Arpo, leaning in closer to Dupenza. "They do not need it. They are with the Emperor." Dupenza recoiled horrified. "You would desecrate the dead, Arpo. They fought to protect our world, to protect us. Do not insult them." Arpo opened his mouth but was caught mid-breath. Lieutenant Arya approached the acolytes. She knelt down next to them, bringing a finger to her lips. Dupenza nodded. Apu did as well, though not without some hesitation and a lingering gaze over the two bodies. They had been ordered to be as silent as possible, in the hopes the xenos would not realize they were here. The intention was to move on later, when it might be safer. Dupenza rose, giving up on his attempts to get comfortable. He gestured to the high window that ran around the chapel. He wanted to look outside. Arya nodded. Stepping on the top of the back of one of the old pews, Dupenza walked to the wall and walked over to Optio in Faith Carlis, Lieutenant Arya's second-in-command. The two men nodded at each other before gazing at the landscape, which was lit by the harsh flashes of distant explosions and the dancing flames pouring from wrecked vehicles. The ground was littered with corpses, all in the crimson uniform of the Creedsmen. Dupenza felt a lump rise in his throat at the sight. "Peace be with you, fallen heroes," he prayed, not wishing to shed tears before Carlis. It did not stop him from thanking the Emperor for still being capable of such a human gesture amid all the horror. Surely grief is no source of shame, he thought. Dupenza thought of Carlis, Arya, and the others. How must it feel to be forced to look upon so many dead comrades, he wondered. What was terrifying was that there should be so many more, but the blasphemous Necron technology reduced many of them to less than ash when they were hit. He could not help but notice there were no Necron dead. It was a little consolation that the xenos disappeared after being struck down. He had learned enough from the soldiers to know that the Creedsmen had been thoroughly beaten. In the name of the Emperor, I curse all of you soulless monsters who did this to them. He felt the urge to spit, but refrained, lest they breach Lieutenant Arya's discipline on revealing their position in some way. He saw movement. Tapping on Carlos' arm, he pointed. Dupenza strained his eyes. Yes, there, he thought. Two soldiers, Creedsmen. They moved furtively from one patch of cover to the next. Do they know we are here? Maybe they are looking for us. Dupenza inhaled, ready to yell to the two soldiers. Before he could shout, Carlos covered Dupenza's mouth with one large, dirt-encrusted hand. The Optio in Faith shook his head. Dupenza gestured at the two soldiers, pleading with his eyes. Carlos shook his head again, though he did not meet Dupenza's eyes this time. Dupenza ripped Carlos's hand from his mouth, jumping down to speak to Lieutenant Arya. There are two soldiers out there, Creedsmen, he whispered. Be silent, acolyte, said the lieutenant. The enemy will find us. She, too, could not meet his eyes. Dupenza hurried back to the windows to see where the soldiers were. If they get close enough, we can wave them in, he thought. Or if no enemies appear, surely. The two soldiers were drawing closer, though Dupenza could see that one was hobbling on a leg that was surely broken. He was using a lasgun as a crutch. The weapon itself was mangled out of shape. The other soldier clutched at a stump where his left arm would have been. Come on, get closer, Dupenza pleaded. Emperor, grant them your fortitude, your healing hand, your encouragement, I beseech you. Save these servants in war, that they may bring death to your enemies on battlefields new. The instant Dupenza concluded his prayer, streams of green lightning shot out of the darkness, scorching the already warped armor of the chimera the two soldiers were leaning against. More blasts quickly followed. The soldiers dashed for fresh cover as the fire intensified. Dupenza saw the shambling forms of xenos emerge from the gloom. Their eyes glowed a sickly green. Crackling viridian energy rippled around the barrels of their firearms, though their expressions bore no emotion, and despite the coldness of their metal form, malice and cruelty dripped from them. Run, faster! Dupenza willed the soldiers on as they made for the chapel, presumably looking to take shelter. We must let them in, he thought. Get here, he shouted, before Carlos could stop him. Expecting the intervention from Optio this time, he wriggled free of the soldier, sending him to the floor with a thud. Dupenza rushed to the door nearest to where the wounded soldiers were running. The door was locked and barred. blocked by more pews as well as anything else the Creedsmen had found that might slow down the entry of an intruder. There was even a dust-coated chandelier and a bust of a saint so old that the writing that would have revealed their name had been worn away. Before Dupenza reached the barricades, he felt a strong arm wrap around his waist and a firm hand cover his mouth. He flailed and kicked, but then another soldier grabbed him. They wrestled him to the floor. They pressed their knees into his thighs. One forced his head firmly against the floor. Dupenza saw stars. He felt like his bones would crack under the pressure of the soldiers putting their weight on him. He could barely breathe. The more he struggled, the harder they held him. Sharp pains lanced through his body and aches throbbed all over. Then he could hear them, the soldiers outside, knocking, not just knocking, banging, even kicking the door, desperate to get in, being prevented by their own comrades. How can you do this in a holy place before the eyes of the Emperor himself? Be still. If we die, we cannot serve, hissed one of Dupenza's subduers. You speak to reassure yourself, coward, thought Dupenza. Faithless coward. Xenos take you. Let us in, shouted the troops outside. Dupenza heard more scuffles, more disagreements. The other acolytes were wondering what was going on. So were some of the Creedsmen. He heard fights break out. He heard men and women raise their voices at each other. He heard them shout. Some called for silence, others cursed those who left their comrades to die, and still others struggled to tear away the barricades and let in those outside. He felt a fresh wave of pain as one of his fellow acolytes was thrown to the floor, striking the soldiers who were pinning Dupenza down. The sudden impact knocked his head hard. He tasted copper. He felt his ankle twist sharply, and he screamed in pain into the hand of whoever it was that covered his mouth. Then he heard a scream above all the wrestling of the acolytes and the Creedsmen, a sound that made him stop. Screams. Terrible screams. They barely lasted seconds, but scored themselves into Dupenza's brain. It was the soldiers outside. The Necrons had slain them. More sounds followed, quieter, but even more chilling. The irregular clank of metal legs, the crushing of broken stonework underfoot. They're coming. This is your fault, someone shouted. The order was silence, he heard another argue. How could you leave your own comrades? They would have found us. They would have found us anyway. Dupenza tried to shout, to tell them to stop fighting, to urge them to focus on the threat at hand, but it was no use. The troops holding him did not budge. All the while the arguing continued, voices growing louder, threats becoming graver. The bickering stopped. Dupenza did not know why at first, but whatever had caused it was so shocking that the soldiers pinning him to the floor released a little of their grip. He turned his head. He saw the door. The looser barricades had also fallen to the floor or been pulled away. The door itself was split down the middle. Poking through the narrow hole was what looked like a heavy axe blade covered in dried blood and congealed brain matter. Pouring in through the gaps around the split in the door was a green glow that bathed much of the chapel space. Dupenza's heart beat faster. His sweat flowed freely. His breath grew erratic. Emperor, have mercy on us. Argolish in flames. The galaxy is being torn asunder, and new war zones are exploding into life with ever-increasing frequency. On the cardinal world of Argolish, faith in the Emperor proves to be a powerful weapon against the Necron legions. The war for Argolish resulted in the ruin of beautiful spires and the destruction of countless relics. Much of the fighting was intense and claustrophobic, as the Imperial armies fought the Necron menace in the hallowed cloisters, halls and corridors of grand battle chancels and bastion chapels. this being an excerpt of the introduction to Chapter 7 of Volume 7 of the definitive account of the War of the Pariah Nexus, written by myself, esteemed appointed historitor Alphus Recorric Smythe. Composed within the rumbling confines of the fine Crassus armoured assault transport, his mighty tread, en route to witness the field of Group Master Maran's latest victory. This chapter will elaborate on all of the many actions fought on Argolish. In this introduction, however, I will highlight a handful of examples to give the reader an understanding of the nature of the fighting, and also identify some of the battles I have deemed among the most interesting and or pivotal. The planet of Argolish, with a population of 16,926,637,015. Last population census before emergence of Pariah Nexus. Actual numbers now indeterminate. Primary classification, Cardinal World. Secondary classification, Paradise World. Segmentum Ultima. Gravitum, 0.9 of Terran approximately. Tithe produce. Argolish is exempt from the tithe due to its status as a capital cardinal world. Nevertheless, it provides regiments for the Astra Militarum, as well as priests. Notable military elements. Innumerable fratis militia elements, numbering some tens of millions, including Argolishan creedsmen, Argolishan faithful, and Argolishan martyrs that would be. Notable presence of Adepta Sororitas orders of Our Martyred Lady, the Argent Shroud, and the Bleeding Heart. Planetary Governor. Cardinal Exemplar Edwin Regularis Hephaestus. It is with considerable surprise that I have been able to discover much, if any, information about Argolish's earliest years as an Imperial world. It seems that its name is derived in some way from Veronica Argovian's name, but I have not been able to confirm either way. Given Argolish's pre-war natural beauty, in areas not developed for habitation and worship, of course, it is quite possible that those who first set eyes upon its wonders and basked in the serenity of its environments believed that only blessings from the Emperor could create such a place. What scraps of records I have managed to uncover make reference to a number of flowering plant forms. Somehow, it appears that early colonists learned they could derive extremely powerful narcotics and hallucinogens from them. There is a significant gap in records between these fragments and what comes later. All that is apparently recorded is that some time later, the ecclesiarchy took special interest in Argolish and settled, investing enormous wealth into the planet. What they created was a true marvel. Thousands upon thousands of cathedra, sanctuaries, chapels, chancels, basilicas, all sublime examples of mankind's proficiency in the arts of construction. Their building materials were brought to Argolish from dozens of other worlds. These buildings of worship, as well as any other architecture, whether they be menial habitations, governing palaces, or even sewer works, have been constructed to fit within Argolish's natural world. A basilica might not only have the pillars of the finest marble, but also of immense trees. Many fonts of holy water might have been natural springs. Vast coastlines became cathedra unto themselves. Even the smallest sanctuaries dedicated to saints, all but forgotten, boasted luscious gardens. A significant portion of this fusion of worship, architecture, and the natural world is now destroyed. The stunning living harmony of mankind with the natural world, granted to us by the Emperor himself, reduced to harrowing skeletal forms or even ash. Oh, how I would have wished to see it in all its glory. Task Force 11. Unlike many worlds in the Argovon system, when Task Force 11 arrived at Argolish, the world was not enveloped by the war with the Necrons. Despite this miraculous turn of events, a gift of time with which to make preparations, or for the plan's leadership to dispatch reinforcements to other worlds in the system, the advantage appeared to have been largely wasted. Admiral Uzziah Rojko immediately set to work, noting in her journals that the turrets were rusting, the ramparts were crumbling, the defenders were gone too fat. There was no way of knowing when the Necrons would attack, nor from which vector, only that the attack would come sooner or later. Two things were on Rojko's side in rallying defenders. First, faith is strong in a cardinal world, and thus the effects of the stilling were notably weaker. Her troops were sharper and more determined, as were the defenders, than those of other worlds. Her second advantage was that, thank the Emperor, the planetary governor was aware of his world's military deficiencies and sought to improve them. Though only in power for 5 months at the time of the Great Rift's emergence, and therefore having little time to achieve the kind of martial readiness Rojko had hoped for, Cardinal Exemplar Hephaestus had been pushing for improved maintenance of military infrastructure for years as a more junior official, and once in power, he invested enormous wealth in beginning what later turned out to be vital improvements. It is truly a blessing from the Emperor that at Argolish's time of need, the Emperor sent a leader with the strength and willingness to foresee troubles that might lay ahead and work towards preparing for them. As it turned out, Rojko and Hephaestus had barely 6 weeks to make what additional preparations they could. During that time, the war for Veronica had escalated in intensity over and beyond the already severe expectations. Most frontiers in the Argovon War were forced to send troops to help the effort to secure the Adeptus Mechanicus' forge shrines and Noctilith mines there, and Argolish was no exception. Hundreds of thousands of troops were pulled away, hampering the defense efforts considerably. The Necrons attacked Argolish via their fleets, as well as a number of devices named by some Mechanicus Sinologians and inquisitorial documents as Dolmen Gates. Their numbers were huge, though to understand the alien is an impossible, indeed undesirable thing. It isn't improbable that they struck hard here in response to the fact that the stilling failed to gain a significant foothold on Argolish. With the troops on the surface and Imperial Navy and ecclesiastical fleets in orbit operating at a high state of readiness, our forces were as ready as they could be to respond to the Necrons' offensive, which was carried out with incredible speed. Within days of its commencement, Cathedra burned unchecked, and Argolish's orbit was choked with debris from destroyed vessels. Such was the intensity of the naval conflict, witnesses on the ground saw the monstrous ecclesiastical cruiser, "In His glorious name we serve," ripped in half by a rippling of huge explosions, like flowers blooming at 100 times their natural speed. The St. Jedi Chapel, though far from the largest, was the oldest and most secure of all of Argolish's many thousands of cathedra, basilicas and other places of worship. When I heard of its fall, I confess, I wept. But fall it did, in one of the most unexpected moves the Necrons made in the Argolish fighting. Being situated deep in a valley and some distance from large settlements, it had little tactical or strategic value. This location was where it is thought that St. Jedi, Argolish's first saint, first landed on the planet, and it was ever since left sacrosanct. The chapel constructed there made up for its lack of outward beauty by its interior decoration and crypt, which was packed full of holy relics and simulacra dating back millennia. The stunning fresco, "Thereby the Emperor Raises Humankind," painted by the half-blind priest Difonso Jasael. The beautiful 4-meter-tall solid gold chalice of martyrdom and victory, which was carried to no fewer than 83 wars by Argolishian Astra Militarum regiments. The tapestry known simply as Vindicatum depicted troops from a number of units from Argolish's Imperial Guard and Frateris Militia tradition standing over the corpse of all 36 xenos species, all priceless works, all lost. Many of these artifacts are famed in scholarly and artistic circles. Their loss is immense. Countless refugees have fled to the chapel, praying for safety and salvation from the Necron onslaught. For a while, it seemed safe. The Necron efforts were focused on the locations of greater strategic significance and stronger Imperial resistance. But somehow, the Xenos must have noticed the importance of this chapel. It was, as one would expect, well guarded, but it was not constructed as a fortress like the war chapel of St. Boniface and the Templar citadel of St. Pergamo Bloodmace were. When a Necron tomb ship descended into low orbit without warning, breaking off from the battle, there was nothing anyone could do. In near atmosphere, it bombarded the St. Jedi chapel and everything within a 20-kilometer radius. Nothing was left. Hundreds of thousands died. The damage done to our culture by these wars is incalculable. Only by faith in the Emperor and trust in Lord Commander Gilliman can we hope to recover what we have lost. Given the sprawling nature of Argolish's architecture and the violence raging in so many locations at once, it has proven all but impossible to identify individual battles. Fighting in some areas went on for months or even years, spreading into other areas and receding like an irregular tide. That the Necrons fought with deep, cold tenacity cannot be doubted, but our troops met them with incredible zeal and fury. Almost every soldier, from recent conscript to hard-bitten veteran of a dozen wars, fought under the gaze of the Emperor himself, and often in the view of his saints, in the form of painting, statuary, and more. Every pull of a trigger, every thrust of a bayonet, every swing of a chainsaw was an act of loyalty before great heroes as well as the saviour of mankind. Around these warriors were daily reminders of why they fought, and it is without exaggeration or hyperbole that I say that their valour is practically peerless with any other war zone I have studied. I have the journals and notes from thousands of regimental commissars who observe, in some cases with great surprise, and dare I say disappointment for a handful, that they did not have to carry out executions for cowardice once. There are some actions that I think can be highlighted that are indicative of this courage. The Basilica of St. Gertrude the Gentle was one of many that had fallen into a state of serious disrepair under successive local leaders. Work on redevelopment and refortification had barely begun by the 235th Sabiniari Pioneers and the 1,605th Cadian Combat Engineers when the Necrons attacked Argolish. The only combat troops garrisoning the Basilica were a detachment of Argolishian faithful. Colonel Reeve Dansk, commander of the Cadians present, described him as an oafish, overexcited and dangerously innocent, commenting that their enthusiasm only makes them more untrustworthy. In his view, he fully expected his own troops to take on the bulk of any frontline duties should the Basilica come under attack. The colonel's doubts were truly unfounded. When the Basilica came under attack, it held for 3 weeks without reinforcement against successive waves of Necron troops. The pioneers and engineers improvising all manner of mines and booby traps that the Argolishians placed with, in the colonel's words, insane courage. Though roughly half the troops involved were killed or wounded by the battle's end, their efforts bought vital time for the continued work to improve the fortifications of the nearby Sanctuary of St. Justina, the death of mutants. That sanctuary not only never fell to the Necrons, but it served as a launch pad for the Great Surge of the war's 6th year, which reconquered vast swathes of territory from the Necrons and signalled the end of the beginning of the conflict. Argolish was home to possibly millions of relics, many centuries or millennia old, according to the ecclesiastical texts I have been able to acquire. There were so many that the existence of some was even forgotten over time, their caretakers passing into the embrace of the Emperor without finding or securing successors. The embalmed remains of St. Bephonica, once of an unknown order of the Adeptus Sororitas, was one such relic. Their location discovered by chance during the ferocious fighting in the vast expanse of the pleasure gardens of a centuries past Cardinal Exemplar. Battle Sisters of the Order of the Iron Rosethorn sought to rescue them. Many of their number lost their lives moving to the relic's site, deep within contested battle zones, hounded constantly by Necron assassins as well as fighter craft. Many more fell retreating back to Imperial lines. Specific details of the fighting appear to have never been recorded. All discussion of the event in later documentation talks largely of the effort's success and the considerable number of casualties suffered. Caranus Preceptor Gisela of the Order of the Bleeding Heart. Sabathine Gisela was nominated by her peers in Task Force 11 to be the voice of the Adepta Sororitas among the Task Force's senior command staff. Though from a relatively minor order, her reputation, skills and experience must have made her an obvious choice. Though of advanced years, anyone I have interviewed to ask of her character has been clear that she was as physically robust as battleship armor, with a strength of will and faith that could see her through a walk from one end of the warp to the other. Physically tall, with closely cropped white hair and hazel amber eyes ablaze with earnest activity, analysis and scrutiny, she was as formidable in mind as in stature. Much of her face was marked with scars, many quite savage, which left none in doubt as to her battlefield experience. It is clear from reading transcripts of senior command briefings and other reports that her words were taken perhaps more seriously than any other during the fighting on Argolish. Details of her illustrious career can be read elsewhere in this chapter, and indeed in many other sources available to readers. But one area of her expertise and experience I feel is worthy of being noted here. She spent years of her life fighting the Necrons against xenos of multiple far-reaching subsectors. She orchestrated the raising of a Necron tomb complex on Dihazab IV with a number of other orders, Mordian Iron Guard Astra Militarum, and a contingent from the Sons of Auror Space Marines chapter. She boarded the capital ship of a tomb fleet, leading a force of thousands of battle sisters of her order, as well as troops of the 13th Omicroni Golems and 34th Betic Centaurs Militarum Tempestus regiments. Notably, she struck down a Necron lord in a single combat at the high point of the Amarok Crusade, an act which many scholars consider to be the turning point of that long, brutal conflict. There were few in Task Force 11 whose burning hatred of the Necrons, understanding of their methods and capabilities could match hers. The Black Templars. The Black Templars chapter of the Adeptus Astartes spent many months fighting on Argolish. Their drop pod strikes, rapid thunderhawk-borne incursions, and intransigent stubbornness turned defeat into victory wherever they struck. They shattered a Necron column heading to the exposed rear position of their 122nd Chancelian Cannoneers as they fired relentlessly to keep the Pilgrim Way out of Necron hands. The Black Templars spearheaded the breakout at the Rosad Salient, where Imperial troops had been trapped for weeks in a horrifying quagmire by tireless phalanxes of Necron warriors and ceaseless bombardments. Subdecons reported to the Argolishian creedsmen in the area speak of glorious, roaring war engines, spitting fire, bathing the foe in righteous fury of our Emperor, and holy vengeance advancing before us clad in the armour of zeal and armed with the swords of piety. For several days they fought shoulder to shoulder with sisters of the Order of the Argent Shroud and troops of the 78th Cadian Shock Troops and 811th Argolishian Cannonites at the breach of the St. Agopius Chapel Bastion's Great Eastern Wall. It was said that the bodies of the dead were so numerous that the breach was practically filled with them.